Today's episode has slides that you can use to follow along. These slides can be obtained at patient-endurance.org/episode-18.
Greetings. This is the Patient Endurance Podcast with Steve and Dale. Today we will make a slight detour with a discussion on science and DNA, which will provide a foundation for our next discussion. But what did we cover last time? Well, we went into the eighth beast empire, who it was, and then who was the beast of the sea, and especially who is Gog. The beast of the sea from Revelation 13 is equivalent to the fourth beast of the sea from Daniel 7. The fourth beast represented Rome, and it had 10 horns. And there was one large horn that came up and subdued the other 3. So we determined that the sea represents the nations. Now in Revelation 17, the beast who once was and now is not, he belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. This is talking about the eighth beast. And in Revelation 13:2, it says, he resembles a leopard, had feet like a bear, a mouth like a lion, which could literally be Greece, Persia, and Babylon. Or, by the same token we mentioned, they might be symbolic of characteristics of the eighth beast empire that are based on these 3 nations. He had a mortal wound. Was this literal or symbolic? Which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. This is where, literally, it might be the same person being resurrected. But let's take a look at this. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. So it's quite possible the eighth beast will come in the spirit of one of the prior beasts. And it really doesn't matter, because in either case, we were telling you always to watch. Watch for the signs. Watch for the characteristics. We will know the individual by his fruit. Initially, it's going to look good. People will praise him. Just look at Hitler when he first started out. He was being looked at as a savior for Germany. Later, once he got into power, everything went south. We also spent time proving that Gog of Magog in Ezekiel 38 was the Antichrist. So at the end of the day, we told you to learn the lesson of the fig tree. When we see these things happening, we know the time is near. So as always, watch and live the life God wants you to live.
So what we're doing is we're trying to examine the eighth beast empire and see if there's anything that we can understand. And so next time, what we're going to do is look at Ezekiel 38 and see if we can see the 10 kings. Since Gog is the Antichrist, Ezekiel 38 talks about a bunch of nations. Is he giving us some of these 10 kings? And God uses the language of the table of nations. He doesn't use names that we would recognize today. And so it makes it a little more difficult. Why has God done that? Probably because he's trying to make something that we can understand through time and not, for instance, let's say it's America. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying, what if? Well, there was no America. How would we recognize that or understand it? You can't. And so he's using something that crosses time. Now, this time we're way out there, okay? I'll just tell you, this is not a biblical discussion. We will throw in some biblical references, but today we're going to talk about DNA. There's a reason we're going to go do that. The biggest reason is what we've noticed is there are Christians out trying to use DNA to analyze the table of nations. One group is Answers in Genesis is doing this, but there's several others out there. And the question is this feasible? We're going to try and come up with an answer to that. First, we got to lay in some background to DNA analysis. What is DNA? What are haplogroups? Can they be used to analyze the table of nations? What does science tell us about haplogroups? And then we're going to end with a discussion on this thing called genetic entropy. I think the one thing that really is interesting as we get into this, Christians need to consider that science is actually backing what God says, not the other way around, and that evolution was a theory, and we would even contend it didn't even get that far, and it's wrong. One of the things is scientists have actually falsified evolution. What does it mean to scientifically falsify something?
Well, we're going to get into that. One of the things that you should know is evolution became really popular before genetic science was there. Once you started hitting the 80s and then into the 90s, we started learning more and more about how the cell works and how our body works. And what we found is evolution doesn't make sense. In fact, we find just the opposite. We find that genetics actually backs up what the Bible tells us, and we're going to be getting into that. So let's look at some basic components here. One, what is DNA? Well, it's actually a unique identifying code in all living creatures. What you look like, the color of your eyes, height, etc., the things we consider the race of an individual. This is only about 1% of the DNA. The rest of the DNA is actually a control system that helps us to grow, helps us to regulate our body, and is in a process that helps us age. That other 99% gives your cells instructions. They use it to build proteins, to build ligaments, to build bones, drive cellular functions. So DNA itself, you probably heard, is a double helix structure. Each nucleotide, and there are 4 of them, have a sugar and phosphate backbone, which connect together to form this double helix. Now, the interesting thing is you have 4 base pairs that do all the encoding of the DNA. And we have 23 pairs of chromosomes that are tightly wound lengths in the DNA. In addition to chromosome DNA, which is in the nucleus of the cell, we have something else called mitochondrial DNA, which is in a subcomponent of the cell that is the powerhouse of the cell and regulates or gives us energy. And that's inherited through one's mother, where the Y DNA is inherited through one's father. And the Y DNA is called the sex chromosome, because a father can either give an X or a Y. So the mother always gives an X. So the father determines the sex of the child. If it's a Y, it's a male. If it's an X, it's a female. Bottom line is DNA is the basic building blocks of life, just like zeros and ones are the basic building blocks of a computer code. And those zeros and ones form what they call a machine language, which is the subcodes. And that's exactly what the DNA does. It forms a sublanguage with the nucleotides.
Yeah, isn't that crazy, Steve? It's like a computer code. I've never heard of a computer code that was developed on its own. It takes designers to think through and make a computer code and then program a computer code. How would it evolve?
That's a thing a lot of the original biologists missed. You go back 100 years, biology was an observation science. So they looked at people and different species and they followed the observations. Today, we have facts to back it up. So let's go a little deeper. We were not here by an accident. The creator created a complex coding system, and it did not pop into being without the hand of God on it. So look at sequence complexity. The probability of a functional DNA sequence, like a gene, forming a random chemical collision is mathematically near zero. There are thousands and thousands of nucleotides on a single chromosome, let alone 23 of them. And each one of those chromosomes and the length of them have particular functions. So a codon is a group of 3 nucleotides. And with 4 DNA, you can get 64 combinations. In those codons, or what is probably similar to a machine language, you have a start codon, a finish codon, and then each of the other codons, like any 3 nucleotides, will code for a particular amino acid. So as you go down this line, it codes for a series of proteins which form enzymes. Now, the thing about an enzyme is in life, all molecules are right-handed. What does that mean? If you take a carbon atom, it has 4 points on it. And think about 3 going down like a 3-pronged footstool, then 1 going up. A right-handed molecule will circle one way, a left-handed the other, but they'll be mirror images of each other. In chemistry, if I were running a chemical reaction, and I have a chemical background, you mix your chemicals together, and you'll get a 50-50 mixture of left-handed and right-handed. You will never get all right-handed or all left-handed. The only way that happens in nature is you need an enzyme to make right-handed molecules. Well, where do we get the enzyme? Well, you need DNA to get the enzyme and code for it. So we're left here with the chicken and egg paradox. But it's not really a paradox because we have a creator that put these 2 ends together. And not only that, but it even gets more complicated. There are repair mechanisms inside of the DNA when it's coding and replicating. And DNA itself is susceptible to damage. It's called oxidation. And you could get oxidation of the DNA, which can cause mismatches in what nucleotide goes down, UV light damage. But the body has repair mechanisms to control a lot of these and repair the damage. Well, that's interesting. So I have the chicken and egg scenario. I have mechanisms that are made to repair it. And we're being told this is a random process that just a bunch of goo just got thrown together and life popped out. No, this is a creator. I can't make a computer program that runs, that you see with the databases on your system, whether it's a word processor or your navigating system, and just throw zeros and ones into a system and boom, there it goes, it pops out. Not going to happen.
And the more complicated the code, the more design and intention had to be there. I mean, you don't get an airplane out of nothing. We had to design it, and we used computers to design it. The deeper the detail, the more of a intentional design is required. And so this kind of leads to what that other 99% of the DNA. And for many years, especially in the 90s, okay, what they would say, oh, that's junk DNA. That's unused. And that's because evolutionists didn't know what it was. Well, no one knew what it was. It wasn't until about 2010 when the government started new studies to actually understand the rest of the genetic code that they began to realize what its true function was in reality. So between 2010 and 2016, they've now determined that there is no junk DNA. Everything is used. It is a control system, a very, very complex biological, digital, multi-redundant feedback control system. Now, that's big words. But for us who are engineers, that's how you control an airplane. That's how you control brakes in a car. That's how you control an engine. That's how you control everything. And what's the redundancy? Well, I got to have multiple redundancy because if one breaks, I don't want the system to crash. So we have in airplanes a quad redundant flight control system. I don't want one redundancy. I got to have 4 to make certain that thing will continue to fly. And it's a feedback system in that I have to continually give feedback to the system so it knows, oh, I'm not crashing. I'm actually going where I want to go. And it's the same with any process. It doesn't have to be an airplane. And we use this extensively now throughout everything. This is what's on your phone. This is what's controlling processes inside of industrial processes. It is super sophisticated. To think that just evolved is just ridiculous in my mind.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing on here to what they always saying about the 1990s, the junk DNA. I got my doctorate in 1995. It took me 1 week to run a simple sample of DNA, to isolate it, put it in the gel, and then do the analysis. By 2010, they had what we were nicknaming shake and bake. You take your material, you put it in a little tube, you shake it, boom, you run your gel. That's 1 hour versus 7 days. The science is going so fast, and plus high-speed computers to process it is letting us now know there is no junk.
Exactly. And this is why the mutations that we're getting are so much more harmful than we thought. It's not just changing the parts that are coding what we look like and such. It's affecting the control systems that are in there. These are complex biological control systems at the cellular level. So these are little nano machines that are running around in your cell, actually controlling processes within the cell, and then they do all kinds of things. And many of these have feedback control so that, oh, I need to repair this. It'll tell a different process that repairs it, go repair this, and it'll start working on it. It's crazy.
An example of a defect, just imagine you have your car, and something everyone has, and it gets a flat tire. You're still moving, but you're not moving as good. Mutations are kind of like the same thing. Sometimes you could have a fatal mutation, and your whole engine cracks open. Other times, though, it's more like a flat tire. You're still trugging along, but just not as good.
Right. And the complexity of even from generation to generation, it doesn't necessarily affect the next generation the same way. We see that some of these things are recessive genes that it takes multiple generations for it to pop back up. So it's extremely complicated. The DNA is an advanced control system. We just don't see it happening. So we want to switch quickly to someone who he's not into DNA, but his name's Dr. James Tour. And Dr. Tour is a guy who is at the heart of a lot of research in America. He's published 650 research papers. He's got over 200 patents. He's a renowned chemist and nanotechnologist at Rice University. He has a strong Christian faith, and he applies that to his scientific work. The thing about Dr. Tour that I really respect is that he's done it. You don't just go and make nano machines, okay? It's super, super hard. And yet he's done it, and he's a chemist, and he's done the things that make it work. So you don't get 200 patents by just sitting around in a lab. He's making things that work, and so he knows how to make the science work to make things work. That's different than a lot of people. And so one of the things, because he's a Christian, he saw that people really weren't getting the science behind the origin of life, or what's called abiogenesis. So he started looking into it himself, and what he finds and puts out is just absolutely fascinating. You don't have to believe the junk science that's out there that's telling you we came from primordial soup. If anything, he's telling you, and it's very similar to what Steve just told you about the right-handed, left-handed molecules. No, it doesn't work that way. We didn't come from soup because you never could get the right stuff at the right place at the right time with the right chemistry. And what he's telling us in many of these things is time doesn't help you. So you can add more billions of years and it doesn't help you, because there's a point in the chemical reaction where more time is actually going against you. And so now, if you don't have the right stuff there to make the reaction happen, it's done. It's over with. That reaction's done. And more time, more billions of years to get this will never solve this problem. And what he points out many times is we're actually getting further and further away. And when we talk about this origin of life, what's it all about? It's all about DNA. How do you build DNA from sugars, right? That's why we were talking about the sugar. You can't make it happen. How do you make these enzymes? They can't make it happen. And yeah, I could make it happen in a lab today with super refined chemicals. Try doing that in something that is more like what the earth was. No one is even close to cracking that. And so don't let people fool you on that. Why is this? Why do you think it's so difficult? Okay. Well, let's go back to what we talked about, Jeremiah 31. Only God set the laws and times. And Genesis 3, man must not eat from the tree of life lest he live forever. And I would add to that, in a state of sin, he doesn't want us living forever in our current state. He wants to fix us, and then we live together.
And there's an important point here, because I fully believe, as a scientist, that we are making our own Tower of Babel by controlling DNA, and God's not going to let us control DNA. Why? Well, he told us in Genesis 3, he is not going to allow man to discover the key to the tree of life.
Yep.
So I don't know when exactly the tribulation is going to occur, but I know it's going to be before we break that ceiling and discover the key. So let's go into, what is the Y chromosome DNA versus mitochondrial DNA? Well, I mentioned that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, and you had the XX, which is the female, the XY, which is the male. And these chromosomes are in the nucleus. You only get the Y chromosome in the male. So that means we can trace genetic defects in the Y chromosome backwards to your father, to your grandfather, all the way to the beginning. Now, the other side of that coin is the mitochondrial DNA. We only get this through our mother. It's in the egg cell. It resides in the cytoplasm of the cell, not the nucleus. And the mitochondrial is the part of the cell that supplies energy. So when we use our muscles, we need energy. When we make things in the body, we need energy. The mitochondrial is that fuel house. Now, some people may ask, well, what about sperm? Doesn't that have mitochondrial DNA? Yeah, young sperm does. But by the time the sperm matures and is used for fertilization, it has no mitochondrial DNA. So now we have two unique paths, a Y chromosome coming through the father, and then the mitochondrial DNA, which comes through the mother. And either one of these can be used to trace lineage backwards.
So let's look at this term called haplogroups, because haplogroups are how scientists see that tracing that Steve's talking about. And pretty much haplogroups are seen because of the mutations. So, and they're the mutations of our great-grandmothers and great-great-grandfathers. And so what's a mutation? Let's first if we look at our slides here, we've got a little chart that shows, okay, you have a coding of TAACTG. And a mutation, specifically a point mutation, that then changes to say TAACC. And so the T is gone, and now we have another C. And what we can see when we sequence the DNA is we can see that change. And one thing to think about is prior to the flood, there really weren't that many mutations. They had protection from the atmosphere, which was much thicker. And after the flood is when mutations really accelerate. And this is largely why our lifespan has shortened, because we've lost this protection in the atmosphere. And the thing is, mutations aren't always bad. Mutations can be good, bad, or neutral. One thing is mutations tell a story. And so let's continue to look at that.
And I want to build on what Dale just said there. If you see the CTG up top on the original, then the CCG, that's a codon 3 DNA that you're coding for something entirely different. If that were a start codon, you'd never even be able to begin to build the enzyme. It would just never trigger. If that was a stop codon, it would just keep on going and going, and you'd build something incredibly long. And in most enzymes, there are 3 critical points, because the enzymes have anchors at each end that hold different molecules, and then it has an active point in the center that brings those two together and forms a reaction. If any of those 3 points are hit by a mutation, you've just killed the functionality of the entire enzyme. That's a critical mutation. And we see those in our society where people get a point mutation that is deadly. So let's look at what we can use these things for. Now you'll see a map on this slide, and you'll look at different letters being used for the haplogroups. From a top level, haplogroups are assigned letters of the alphabet, and a deeper refinement consists of additional numbers as you go down. But one of the things you'll see in this diagram with the starting up the upper left-hand corner and then going down to these subpoints, what's interesting is that upper left-hand corner goes to one person. And then it starts splitting from a defect, it splits again. And we know that one person, some people will say it goes all the way back to Adam. In reality, it goes to Noah, but Noah did go back to Adam. And then they try to look in that, okay, if that's Noah all the way at the top, then somehow Ham, Shem, and Japheth are going to be grouped in this next layer down. But there's a couple of things here we want to mention. All sons inherit their Y chromosome from the biological father. Now, the thing is, not every son is going to get a defect. Some sons may get more defects. It depends on what conditions the sperm is in and how old the father is. But the bottom line is, mutations do tell a story, as we can see from the chart. And that map actually shows you different migration groups and concentrations of varying Y chromosomes. Now, the next slide is mitochondrial DNA, which is transmitted through the mother. And oddly enough, secular scientists have called this mitochondrial Eve because it traces back to one woman. And others have actually traced it back to 3 women right before the one. And you'll see that in this chart here. You have an N, an M, and then an L. Well, that's 3 women, the 3 wives of Noah's sons. So it all makes sense.
So mutations tell us a story. And, it's interesting. You talked about those maps. How are they getting those maps? Because they're going around. We're now giving DNA, everybody, but they're also going around and digging people up. And what was their DNA? And so they're going around and scientifically trying to figure out who's who.
And the other thing they do is they look at very tight people groups. So they could look at a group of American Indians. They could look at things like the Japanese culture, which is very tightly a nice genetic tight spot. And they've even looked at the Jewish people to see what they have in common.
Exactly. And so as we go, this thing that we see here is called a phylogenetic tree. And the thing about it is you don't necessarily have to draw it that way. And what you see, the tree with the map, that's the secular world's view. And it's a little bit older, not a lot, but as you come along, they've gotten more and more data. And during the Simmons Genome Diversity Project, they generated a tree, and it doesn't start at A, it starts at IJK. It's the same thing. There's 3 main groups that come off. There's the A through F, and actually F is probably the starting point of that group. And then there's I and J, where I is probably the starting point of that group. And then there's another group that's O through R, and and at the center is Noah, and the three main groups are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so man's initial order really doesn't make much sense when you look at what they're saying. Everybody came out of Africa. Everybody starts with A, but the data always shows a single starting haplogroup, and then it's coming down. And so that single, as Steve pointed out, that single haplogroup is not actually Adam, it's Noah. And on the right, as we gather more data, God's story becomes increasingly more apparent. And so you don't have to listen to what the world says. We need to take this and understand it from a Christian worldview, not man's worldview. If you look at that left one as well, look at what their time is. They got it out to 180,000 years. Is it or not? That's going to be highly debated, and we'll give you some reasoning why not to think that from the DNA. So the natural question that comes out of all this, because people have been doing this for a while, and they're starting, it's just natural. The world, not just Christians, are making a story out of this. And they look at where did people migrate from? And the thing to me is the natural thing for Christians is, okay, we need to do the same thing. And we do. There are Christians doing that. Where did they come from? And so which brothers and children migrated where? And so is the secular view of these migrations all wrong? No, not necessarily. But is it right? Not necessarily. And you can't just take one thing and say that's how it was, like we're digging them up and so that's it. No, you also have to apply historical data on these migrations, and how does it actually match? Does it match what we have? Because history is not all wrong.
And we're going to add that other data in the next podcast.
Sure. But one thing I was in Acts here recently, and I found this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this applies right to our discussion. So in Acts 17, 24 through 27, it says, and this is actually Paul at the Areopagus in Athens, and he's talking to them, and it says, he's telling them, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and marked out their appointed times in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. Did you catch that? God did this so that we would seek him and find him. This DNA studies that people are doing, secular world, Christians, God knew this would happen. It's not like this is like, oh, golly, they're going to look at DNA. No, he knows all things. He did this as a pointer to himself. Inherently inside, we are all looking to find God, some more than others, right? But God put that pointer in us.
And this is true, too, of the mitochondrial DNA, which you see in the next picture. And if you notice, it follows some of the same patterns you saw in the Y chromosome. Things are kind of concentrating in the Middle East, and then the arrows go off some go into the Asian area, up through the Bering Strait, down into the Americas and down. Others go into the European area, and then you have a section going down into Africa. So we see that the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA do have a parallel migration pattern, which you would expect. But they're both telling a different story. And if you put them side by side, like we have in the next chart here, it's supported. As I was saying, they go down into the Southeast Asia, down to Australia, over the Bering Strait. And you'll even see some in the Y chromosome, if you look in America there, that some have crossed from Europe into the Americas also. And this gives us very good insight, along with the then archaeological and historical data, to try and determine how these 70 nations migrated from the Middle East and won out into the world, which is information we need if we want to affirm who Gog is.
So what does all this have to do with the Table of Nations? Well, what is the Table of Nations? Well, in Genesis 10, God provides the account of the sons of Noah. And what's interesting, so we have a chart here where we're showing you the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And he doesn't give all of the sons. I don't really know why some and others, okay? But what he says in Genesis 10:32 is, these are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. So he's telling you right here, this is important because this is how he sees the nations. And if you look up at the top, I want to emphasize something here in that the Israelites, they come through Shem. They're actually through Arphaxad and through their sons and through a grandson, Peleg, and that's who Abraham comes through. And so they're from, now who's Arphaxad? That's basically the Babylonians. It's interesting. And he gives the rest of those, and there's 70 of them. And why not others? I don't know. I can't tell you why not others are identified. But given this as a guide, can we understand what the Bible says about the world? And from our perspective, okay, what do we do in this? Can we actually identify what Ezekiel 38 portrays of the modern nations? So can we see these nations in the DNA? That's what we're trying to explore right now. So someone has actually done a lot of study, and that's Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He works at Answers in Genesis, and he wrote a book called Traced. It's a phenomenal amount of work. It took quite a bit for me to read through and understand, which tells you how detailed it is, because a lot of times on books like this, I'll absorb them in a day or two or max a week. It is just so detailed. It's incredible. And the one thing you'll see here is when you look at the picture, it's very similar to when you lay it out from the way the world sees it, but yet not. What he does is kind of like that IJK that I was telling you about, but he uses the representation of a linear set of plot versus a radial plot. But yet he gets to the same thing. And what we find out is it's really easy to figure out Ham. Super easy. They just stick out like a sore thumb. What's a little harder was Japheth and Shem. And one of the problems with his work that I see and others have pointed out is that he takes an obscure haplogroup, T, and he identifies them with the Jews. And that then drives the typing of Shem and Japheth. So T must be the Jews, and therefore that is Shem. The thing is, that's highly inconsistent with studies of the Jewish community. Most studies have pointed toward haplogroup J for the Jews. Is Jeanson wrong? I can't say 100% he is, but let's look at this now. And so there's been a bunch of studies on the Kohanim from 2015 through 2019. So who are the Kohanim? Well, these are ancestors of Aaron, and they specifically did people, they did both sets of Jews. They had people who identified as Kohanim and people who didn't. And what they found in Ashkenazi, so that's basically German Jews, and Sephardic Jews, was that 87% of Ashkenazi Jews, Kohanim, were haplogroup J, and 75% of Sephardic Jews were haplogroup J. And then they also had this genetic marker called the Cohen modal haplotype, and they had 60 to 70% of these Cohen had that. And there were two groups. Half of them were in J1, haplogroup J1, and the other half were in haplogroup J2. And I told you before, from the Table of Nations, we know that Abraham came from Arphaxad. Well, that would tend to tell you that that's J1 or J2, or these are sons of Arphaxad, right? So the Jews were closely related to the Babylonians. I'd point out their cousins are the Assyrians and the Syrians and the Persians. How do we? Because the Assyrians were from Ashur, The Syrians were from Aram, and the Persians were for Elam. And these are all sons of Shem. So the thing that bothered me about Jeanson's study was he picked this really, really obtuse, narrow group that's kind of off to the side, rather than take what should have been obvious. They should be like a lot of other Middle Easterners. And so are the Jews haplogroup J? One looks at that and says, probably. And here's where these guys are. If you look at the maps that we presented, here's the maps of J1 and J2. And guess what? They're in the Middle East / what you would call Asia Minor, not what we think of as Asia today. It's what they called Asia back in Christ time. And so that's in the Turkey area and the Caucasus and in the Middle East, where you'd expect them to be.
So this leads us to the question, can we make a connection to migration patterns with DNA alone? Dale's already given you one example here where people have misread some of the information. And on a chart we're now on, we have folks like Bostrom, also a scientist who is a Christian, and Ashman, who have made two different attempts. The problem is there's some rather big assumptions you make when you look at defects in DNA. The first is that each generation has measurable change in either mitochondrial DNA or their Y DNA. Now, it's actually possible that a father or mother could pass down a perfect set of DNA to their daughter or son with no defects, or you can pass down a DNA with multiple defects. So that's your first problem. The second thing is that mutations do not repeat themselves in other branches. So let's look at Ham and Shem. Suppose they initially had one defect, but then you go down 2 or 3 generations, and maybe their great-grandsons each had the defect of the other group. Well, now, who belongs to which group? We don't know. And it could even get more complicated, because what if a mutation actually fixes itself and it remutates back? So you actually lose the linkage in part of your chain. So some of the chains going forward with a defect, and other parts going forward without it. And then you have the issue, are there no major mixing of haplogroups due to wars and migration, which we know there are. So, based on this, can we use DNA haploid groups for analysis? The answer is yes, but we want to use it in context with which we know historically, from archaeological evidence, and just the migrations of people in general.
So now I want to turn to a couple guys that we've been following, because these are really smart people that like Dr. Tour. The first one is Dr. John Sanford, okay? Dr. John Sanford was a professor at Cornell University. He has a PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics, and he's the inventor of a thing called the gene gun. And this is how you get genetically modified food. What Dr. Sanford and a group of people that were working together on this determined was, if I shoot DNA into the cell wall, I can start to modify it. And the whole goal was not to make mutants. It was to improve food's plant resistance against diseases. And so, people aren't just going out there trying to do horrible things. No, these are people who are trying to make our world better. Now, this guy, again, has 80 scientific papers, and he's got 30 patents. He's also got 2 companies. So what I'm trying to get at is he's a very highly successful guy and knows what he's talking about. And this allowed him to retire from Cornell at 48. And the thing is, he was an evolutionist. His research, though, naturally led him to genetic populations, because I want to know what the effect of my change is to that population. And he's looking at it through an evolutionary lens. But as he continued to look at this data, he started to have contradictions, and it wasn't panning out the way he thought. And this is not the only thing, but in this same time frame, he got saved. Now he's thinking from a Christian worldview, not the evolutionary worldview. And he starts doing research on genetic populations in a new way that he'd never thought of. And it just opened his mind. Now, one of the things is, as he went down this path, he started development of a tool called the Mendel's Accountant. And what this is an advanced numerical analysis simulation. It's a comprehensive biological biologically realistic numerical simulation. And that's important, okay? And it looks at mutations and the selection process. And I'd point out, by his own admission, evolution was my religion until he got saved.
So everything Dale just told you actually led Dr. Sanford to write a book on genetic entropy. And what is this? Well, mutations are word processing errors in a cell's instruction manual. And the mutations systematically destroy genetic information. What he found was that mutations are, for the most part, bad. Now, natural selection can remove a small fraction of mutations. What do I mean by that? I mean, you could have a major defect that'll kill an offspring, and it's not going to go forward. However, with modern science, that's getting less and less probable as we're saving more and more people. So more genetic defects are staying with our population. But even with this intense selection, evolution is pushing us toward extinction. There is powerful evidence that life and mankind must be young. And by young, I mean in the thousands of years, not in the millions of years. This is not just another piece of research. It's been theoretically thorough. There is extensively validated by rigorous numerical stimulations. Oh, and by the way, for one piece of genetic information that we do have a lot of data on, it fits well. And that's the H1N1 Spanish flu. We've seen how this has been changed generation from generation. That's why you get a flu shot every year, because every year it's mutating.
And Spanish flu, they've actually say the original strain is now extinct. Interesting, right? That's fitting with what he's saying.
Yep. So at the end of the day, what does this mean? It means that the theory of evolution is not correct. It was falsified in early years because the people stating it knew they had no one to go against them. Now we got overwhelming evidence to show that it's wrong.
And so let's look at this. What's he saying in genetic entropy? So mutations are our enemy. Entropy is the amount of disorder or randomness in a system. And what genetic entropy is the disorder in our genes due to the mutations in our DNA. This is partially why our lifespan has gotten shorter, because we can't sustain life for longer. And as the mutations hit us after the flood, right? This disorder builds up. And these bad mutations are what Dr. Sanford calls deleterious mutations. They build up over generations. And when you look at this, what he found was, so I've got some charts here, and what he's figured out was we're declining at 1% per generation. This is just what the math shows you. And so what that is 0.99 raised to the nth power. And so if you take that and you look from the Bible, it talks about how there are 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus. That's in Matthew. Add on 10 generations from Noah, and there's 52 generations from Noah. Oh, that's kind of a low-end band. If we look at Luke's account is not the same. One of these is the account for Jesus' human father, Joseph, and the other's for his mother. The second account is most likely from his mother. And if we take and strip off the first generations from prior to Noah, that gives us 67 generations. So when Jesus was alive, there had been 52 to 67 generations in his line, okay, the line of Judah up to him. And so you plot that on the chart, and that tells you where you're at. And at that point, the human race in that line of people, because it can change, some people, this isn't exact, right? Each group is different, but this gives you a good kind of a generic view of it. They were somewhere between 65 and 50% health or fitness by that point as a race, okay? Where are we today? Well, how many generations have there been? Answers in Genesis did an estimate of from Noah to today, and they came up with 77 generations. I don't know how they got that. I don't remember exactly. It was an interesting paper, though. And what they were pointing out is, well, some scientists want to go and say it's just 30 years per generation or 25 years. We'll look at the data and kind of make an assessment. Well, the problem with that is that's not how it actually works. As I was telling you, some people live to be 70 before they have a kid. And so that extends the generation. That's how you get the shorter numbers. These are from older people. The higher numbers are the shorter generational span, like I was telling you. And so what I estimated, just based on the first set, was, okay, let's just say that's 124 generations. And so somewhere in between those is where we're at today. And that's not pretty. That's somewhere between 40% and 30% overall fitness of the human race. Is Dr. Sanford right? I don't know. But he also points out, and we look at this is the reason why our lifespan started changing after the flood, because this started to take effect. And you see a very rapid drop off, and then it's continued on down. And so this is a very strong argument for a young earth. If people were 180,000 years old, in other words, if when Adam came, it was 180,000 years, or even worse, some say 1,000,000 years ago, there's no way. We'd have died out long ago. And so why does Jesus need to return soon? This is a huge reason. We have genetic entropy and we can't get rid of it.
I'm going to introduce one more scientist to you, Dr. Robert Carter. And he's following in the footsteps of Dr. Stanford. And you may wonder, why you two guys, going into these scientists? Well, because that was our job in the Intel community. We'd talk to people, we'd find out who the experts were, we'd look for counter opinions and hear their arguments. And then we would follow those who made the best arguments. That's exactly what we're doing here. And these people have a lot of experience. They've laid down their logic. They've written good papers, and they present really good positive research protocols. And one of the things Dr. Carter does is he has some podcasts on what can DNA tell us about the truth of the Bible. And I've enjoyed some of these podcasts because I think one of the things we fail at sometimes as Christians is apologetics. And if you know science, archaeological evidence and historical evidence, there's a lot you can do when a secular person challenges your faith by bringing up the science and the historical evidence to back it up.
I think, Steve, there's another thing here. We don't have to be afraid that we're the only one saying this.
Well, you agree?
Right? There are very, very smart Christian scientists out there, and they don't agree with the way the world views things. And they don't agree just because they don't agree. I can do that. They don't agree because they understand the science at the level that's required to say that isn't right. That's the difference between these guys that we're pointing out.
Dr. Tour does a wonderful job on his podcast on getting very technical and letting folks challenge him. And no one's been able to challenge him.
Exactly. And really, nor has anybody in the population science, genetics community been able to challenge Dr. Sanford.
When you got good data, it speaks for itself.
Yes. Now, one of the things that Dr. Carter has done, we talked about how he basically is a protege of Dr. Sanford. He has taken Mendel's accountant to a whole new level and used it to generate scientific papers. And one of the papers he talks about is this thing he wrote on called Patriarchal Drive. You have to remember, Noah was 500 years old before he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were 100 years. They didn't start having kids until after the flood. They're 100 years old before they started having kids. Does that matter? Well, yes. And on creation.com, which is where they generally publish, there's this really cool table of nations, very similar to the paper that Dr. Carter wrote that shows the radial Simmons genome diversity phylogenetic tree, and it's remarkably similar. Interesting. Now, don't take that and say they're the same, because they're actually not. I have Shem, Ham, and Japheth in different spots on the table of nations, but it's still, you can see the similarities. It's obvious. And so, what to me is important is he's got a different worldview because he's a Christian. It is feasible to think we can map out the table of Genesis 10, but to start this section, he re-looks at the Simmons genome data, and you have to look really closely at that center, okay? It is promising, but there's problems. So if you go to our next slide, the problem is the oddities in the phylogenetic tree. And we look at those, and the innermost branches are not the result of slow accumulation of mutations. It's that patriarchal drive. They're high mutation rates. And remember, there's passed on by these old men. That's consistent with the flood story, right? Fathers very old having children. And as Steve was saying, fathers can pass different mutations from child to child. There's no reason to expect every male has the same number of mutations, but there is every reason to expect centuries-old men pass on many times more mutations than a modern average person. And so that's why we get these deep roots. But we also have this problem of, but he can still pass on a perfect
copy of his genes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not only that, but we had a term down here, genetic drift. You know what that is really? It's what I was talking about before. If two different lines have the same mutations, if one of the lines corrects it, after a while, you can't trace it anymore. You got lines that look the same and you don't know where they started or where they end.
And where we're at today, we're basically mutts. Okay. We have a lot of, it's not like we're pure genetically. And so because we have percentages of everything, it's hard to come up with a new line. And so the big thing is it's highly consistent. And what you see here in this chart, what I did is to kind of illustrate this is if we took Bostrom's chart and we just started applying the Table of Nations right across it, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. Does that make sense? Not against historical data at all. And so it's like, oh, that's a problem. If we go on, for instance, into Shem, we look at that and we have Lud. He's placing Lud as I. Why is he doing that? Because he knows that Lud started out in Turkey and I1 and I2 are out throughout Europe. They've got migrated up through there. Yeah, but wasn't he first? No, Lud's the last kid. Actually, Elam's first. And he's he has him as J2, which makes sense because of where they're at. Wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. And so what we're trying to show you here is that, historically, the information and what you see in the maps isn't making sense with what the actual Y chromosome tree is. And so some of it does, but not all of it. And it's like, why? Because of what we just told you about. Because the father doesn't always pass on. It's not this nice, clean thing. And, IJK had IJ, and IJ had I, and then he had J, and then he had J2. It's not necessarily that way. And so it's consistent with what you know from the patriarchal drive and the post-flood, but is it correct for us to use this to make sense of the migration maps?
So is DNA any good? Yes, it is. God has placed DNA information within us to lead us to him and to seek him. What do I mean by this? As a scientist, I look at this and it strengthens my faith. It tells me we started from one man and one woman. The mitochondrial DNA tells me there were 3 women after the flood.
Right.
And they've narrowed it down there. The genetic entropy tells me we're in a young earth. You go back 60 years, evolutionists would say everything God says is garbage. No, we're learning just the opposite. The more we look at science, the more it validates God. And why is that? The Bible tells us we'll know God through his creation.
Yes, that's what we talked about in Acts, right? And this goes against a lot of people, this whole idea that the earth is young. But that's what the Bible says. And so why would that be weird that the Bible's saying what science is showing us? That's not weird. That to me is like...
If anything, it's perfect synergy.
Yeah.
We are seeing the hand of the Creator in everything.
And so, in the end, yes, you can use it. It has some merit for looking at these maps. And we will use a little bit of that data when we look next time. But you can't do this and be really strict about it and say, this has to be Gomer and this has to be Magog and this has to be Madai. No, you're going to have to do much more analysis to actually understand it. That concludes this episode. We're now going to go to what Dave has to say to us.
Thanks, Steve and Dale. This is such a meaty segment on DNA and just the information you've shared with us, the references that you've made available to our listeners in the bibliography at the bottom of the slides. And I hope you, our listener, we'll go back into this, that you have been tracking with us through the slides. You have been soaking up this. You've been even maybe jotting down your own questions or your own debatable concepts that have been shared today. And I want to just reference something for you that you just listen to, that you soak up, and that you just open yourself to accepting and believing. So science has uncovered multiple things that the Bible has recorded already, written hundreds and thousands, literally thousands of years ago in some cases. Just a couple of them real quickly. The whole idea of anesthetics, putting somebody to sleep before surgery, it's right there in the first couple chapters of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, where God puts Adam to sleep and he performs a surgery, removes a rib, and he creates woman out of man. The whole idea of our planets being a sphere, not flat, and the concept of orbiting is found in the scriptures. And with regard to our topic today, DNA, the whole idea that God knows everything about us, and that which he knows is from the very beginning of the conception of life. Your DNA has coded you in such a way that God knows everything about you because he created DNA. Now listen to a passage that was written literally over 3,000 years ago by one of the most central figures in the scriptures, King David of Israel. He writes, as recorded in Psalm 139, listen to these words. You may have heard this, but if you have not, just please, I'm going to read it slowly and you try to listen with intent. David writes, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depth of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. Listener, thank you for just receiving what I just read out of Psalm 139. And I invite you to go back into it. But before I close today, I want to ask you to think of your unique qualities and characteristics, those things that define you, your eye color, your stature, things that you like and dislike, your personality that comes out in certain environments, all of these things. This passage that I read from says that God knows everything about you. And in this podcast, when everything is stripped away, and why we invite you to look at slides and study scripture with us and make comments and write questions, is because God desires to know you so closely that you would know him because of what he's revealed about himself. So we invite you again, stay with us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. God bless.
Dave, that's really awesome. It never ceases to amaze me how in God's word we can find things like what David said, and it is true to us today and relevant. And, you see embedded in there, he doesn't say the word DNA, but you see the understanding, right? And if you don't, I don't know how to get you to see that. But the DNA tells us something. It tells a story to us. DNA validated Adam and a mitochondrial Eve as well. That's secular science. That's not us. Christians didn't come up with that. And yet it points to the very thing the Bible talks about. Genetic entropy. It shows us the earth has to be young. The biblical account of the patriarchs is accurate. The problem is the limitations of DNA. Well, it can be useful for examining trends in migration, but this idea that you can strictly match it to the table of nations and to the haplogroups with complete accuracy probably is not true. So next time we're going to look at where did people migrate to and see what it tells us about the table of nations, and hopefully that tells us something about the eighth beast from Ezekiel 38.
And that's our question of the day. Who is the eighth beast? And your homework will be to read Revelations 13 and 17, and then Ezekiel 38 and 39. The scripture we used today was taken from the English Standard Version and the New International Version of the Bible. At the end of the slide deck, we have all the references for each of the images with a slide number, and also a list of some of the podcasts from these three scientists. Thank you for listening today. This is Stephen Dale signing off. As always, if you have any comments or questions, send us a note. If you disagree, send us a comment with your reasoning and logic. We would like to thank our publisher, Noisy Mouse Publishing at noisymouse.com, for the great job they did editing our podcast and setting up our website. God bless you in your studies of God's Word.